Failure is a natural part of life, and perhaps more so when you have lofty goals and ambitions that you feel drawn toward achieving. Artists are, of course, no stranger to failure. It walks alongside us like Gollum guiding Frodo and Sam toward Mordor, an ever-present part of our life and our journey. But even in this little metaphor, failure is the antagonist. In reality, failure is simply necessary. No artist has ever gotten through their journey without a mountain of failures along the way. We must fail. And if that is the case, what can we do to deal with that fact? Greetings, my name is Zach, and welcome to the podcast. If topics like this are your cup of tea, please consider subscribing for more like this. Why is failure necessary for artistic growth? However you define a failure, they have to occur for you to grow. There are many times that I wish this wasn't the case, and I know many of you do as well. In my years working with students, particularly middle and high school students, failure was seen as the worst case scenario. If a student got to the end of their piece of work and felt like they had failed, it was time to abandon ship, time to abandon this pursuit, maybe take up basket weaving instead because painting was obviously not for them. It's funny how we are so built to look at things this way. And art is just not very forgiving if that's how you look at failure. You can change that, of course. We can all change that and modify that as we get older, as we reflect on our time and on the way we spend it. Innovation and experimentation always involve a couple of wrong turns. Nobody comes up with something totally new, an art style, a particular voice in a novel, without trying other things out for a while. Now, sometimes you get lucky and you land correctly the first time, but that is not usually the case. Most of the time, the artists that we enjoy the most, the musicians, the painters, the drawers, they failed a lot to get where they were. Now, each of those failures probably got them closer to their end goal, but they were, at the end of the day, failures. Failure also gives you a benchmark for knowing where not to go. It's a feedback mechanism. I have this fantastic book that I'll link in the comments below. It looks like it's a children's book, but it's about ideas and it's about learning in general. And in it, the author, through beautiful illustrations and some lovely text, talks about how every sculpture that this old artist in the book made that wasn't exactly what he wanted, they were his friends. They were guideposts in a garden out back that pointed him in the correct direction to go. And this is true. This is how failure works. Every time that I draw something incorrect, if I'm trying to put together the little stories with Andorra like I have been for all my Inktober stuff, like the drawing that you're seeing happening in the background here, every time that I try to draw her and it goes poorly, what I did was clarify an incorrect way to do a thing. That's not how I can display her mouth. That's a really bad way to illustrate gravity with her hair. But every one of those failures is a guidepost. It's like a fence post that I've jammed in the ground and I've connected line to. And now I know not to go over there for this thing. And that's really a beautiful facet of failure. Failure can also be a mechanism to overcome fear. As the fear of failure is perhaps one of the greatest things that turns people away from art, failing repetitively demystifies the thing. It is easier to move onward with failure, and it's not as scary when you've encountered it hundreds of times. And a last of these just quick reasons why it's necessary for artistic growth is that it helps with problem solving. Every time you fail in anything, whether it's math, science, history, literature, or art, you have to analyze why. Why didn't 2 + 2 = 5? Now, obviously that's a bad example, but when you're working through algebra and geometry, there's a lot of that. I thought this added up correctly. I thought that these angles would equal 180, and they don't. But as you start to go through your failures and analyze what happened, what went wrong, you start to learn, and you develop creative ways to solve those problems. Now, already, I feel like we are starting to hit on things that change failure, that change how we think about it, that take it from this word that gives us pause to the name of a particular component in the machine of growth. How we think about failure is largely what determines how we let it affect us. So how can we reframe failure? The word itself is so tainted, so ugly. We hear it and, well, failure is definitive. It's the end of a thing. If you failed at a job, you likely got fired. If you failed a class, you didn't pass it. Maybe you have to redo it now. But if you fail at a piece of artwork, what does that really mean? What is a failed painting? Outside of a class, of course. What does that really mean? Did it not achieve its goal? Do you not feel good about it? Did you understand your feelings going into the piece? Were your feelings rational? Was it not as good as you expected? Did you have a clear definition of success and failure before you began? And that's the key, is that we as the artists, as the creative individuals, have the ability to frame how we look at failure. At the very least, we have the ability to frame our failure conditions. What justifies something or terms something as a failure? We have the ability, if we allow ourselves, if we don't let it just fall to our subconscious or unconscious minds, we can frame what a failure is. And it's most dangerous, like so many of the things that I talk about in these podcasts, it's most dangerous if we don't think about it, if we don't process it. So, how can we think about failure then? I am not naive or optimistic enough to think that any of us are going to change our relationship with something as complicated as failure by hearing a couple nifty points in a podcast. Goodness, I wish it was that easy. Wouldn't that be fantastic? Find the appropriate words to hear and boom, problem solved. If only that's how it worked. And frankly, I wish I had that, because it would mean that over the 11 years of working with those students, I was the magician, the wizard who was capable of dismantling something as complicated and potentially diabolical as failure. Instead, I am functioning off of the assumption that 1, if I am lucky, 2 of these topics might strike a match for you individually, might be the spark that you need to ignite the fire that affects change. It's why I go over so many different things as we discuss these topics, because we as artists are so different from one another, let alone the rest of the world, that I just hope and pray something applies to you as an individual. I try to keep the rambling down to some extent, but I suppose some rambling is inevitable. These are only partially scripted after all. I like to get some of the authentic reactions and rambles in there, and it just inevitably happens. Okay, here are some specific ways to try to reframe failure, to try to rewire how your brain interprets it. Let me know in the comments which of these strikes closer to home for you. And please, if there are any that work for you that I left out, include them as well. They might be of great benefit to other people in the future. And if they're awesome and they're fantastic, and I'm like, goodness, I should have put that in the initial one, I will include them in the next one. Okay, so here's the first other way that we can kind of reframe failure and think about it. We can think about it as an inevitability. I really hope this does not sound like doom and gloom. I know I process things a little strangely, but perhaps some of you are in the same boat as me. To think about failure as being an inevitable and therefore unavoidable part of creating dismantles some of the negative emotions that come with it. If this has to occur, it's part of the process of making things, of being creative, then it's not your fault, right? It's not your fault that it existed. Now, maybe it's your fault that you encountered this particular batch of it, but it's not your fault that failure was encountered. Failure was, after all, always going to occur. And if you know that it's coming, you can prepare, you can brace, you can understand that it's not your mistake necessarily, it's just a part of the process. For me, this helps a ton because I expect it. When I sit down to draw a sketch or a thumbnail for something, I don't expect it to go correctly the first time. I expect to get in there, to get my hands dirty, to have to do the sketch or the thumbnail a dozen times before I nail it. And if it's fewer times than that, then it's fantastic. But I expect it to be something that's going to take a while because failure is inevitable. And so if I manage to skip failure one time on the route to figuring out how to handle this prompt for Inktober or to get this piece to work out, that's just a bonus. That was just a nice part of my day. That was like somebody paying for my cup of coffee. It's a beautiful thing, but I don't expect it. It helps remove some of the responsibility, perhaps, thinking about it this way. At least the emotional part that can lead you to feeling like you failed, and then therefore you are a failure. This is dangerous, right? It is dangerous to think that because you failed doing a thing that you are now a failure as an artist, or worse, to feel like you are a failure as a human being. And this is simply not true. Failure happens. It's part of the process. The least fun part, perhaps, but an integral component nonetheless. Failure can also be seen as an opportunity to learn. Here's the more optimistic side of things, right? I try to convince myself of this, or at least remind myself of this fact when I've had a particularly tough day or I feel like I've been failing a lot. that my failures are an opportunity for me to learn how to move forward, to learn new things and somehow escape this terrible feeling next time. Failure tells you what can be improved and what needs improving. They point out areas of weakness. The clothes look great, but the art is all kinds of strange. Well, there you go. You know what to focus on. And actually, in that metaphor, you wouldn't know what to focus on because there's so many things. But you can focus on the thing that you did well, right? And if you can look at the figure and go, the arms are too long, maybe part of the leg looks funky, then you know that you need to work on those anatomical pieces and you can nail that down. But you can also kind of hold on to that little piece of like, hey, the clothes look good, and that's beneficial for your brain as well. For me, this is often the representation looks good, maybe the rendering looks pretty good, but the composition is boring. Composition is a struggle for me, and it's part of the reason why I thumbnail things so many times, especially for large pieces like you're watching take place in the back here, which I probably didn't thumbnail quite enough, and especially for all the Inktober pieces, because those are pretty dynamic and they're done with ink and they have to be nailed down before you proceed. Failures are a guidepost to what to focus on. And if continual improvement or forward momentum is the goal, then they are exactly what you need in order to move forward. So, though it can sometimes be a little bit difficult, especially if you're a little bit more pessimistic like me, looking at your failures as an opportunity to learn can sometimes be a gentle reminder just to push them away from being only a negative thing in our mind. I heard from a psychologist once, and I don't know if this is true or not, that our brains tend to categorize things in memory as either negative or positive. They don't allow for much nuance. So if you can take that failure, which is obviously a negative when you walk away from the painting or drawing or whatever, and you can wedge that into, no, this isn't necessarily a failure in that sense. It's pointing out that I need to focus on eyes more. It's pointing out that I really need to work on the back anatomy because the subtleties there are really difficult. If you can nudge it just a little bit slightly more toward that positive angle, you might be able to register that memory as a positive memory. And then you walk away and it was a good time of drawing. It was a good drawing session. And we need that. We need the little wins, don't we? Perhaps you can think about failures as stepping stones. They are simply the pain that comes from moving forward. This is a little bit different than inevitability, right? Because there's some forward movement. And the inevitability is just kind of coming to terms with the fact that it exists, it sucks, and that's all there is to it. But for some people, it's going to be good to look at it this way. It's just a part of moving forward. So even if not particularly a learning opportunity or an inevitability, it's just a rickety stone as you cross the river. Your foot touches down and the stone wobbles. It's unpleasant. Maybe you fall into the stream for a moment, but it's just that. It's a natural part of the moving forward. A little uncomfortable, but you build upon the failure to step to greater things. So it's not useless. It's not an inevitability. It's kind of a merger of those two. It's just a step that you're taking forward. This failure is just something that you have to get through in order to get to the next thing. And I suppose there is a more optimistic twist to that than the inevitability, right? It's an idea that you're climbing. This is a rung on the ladder that hurt, but you're still climbing. You're still going vertically. Whereas if it's just an inevitability, it could just be, this is terrible, and here I am sitting in a giant pot of terrible. So maybe thinking about it as just a part of moving forward. It's just, not every truck stop's gonna be great, right? And maybe this is just the stepping stone as you move forward. Maybe you are capable of looking at this particular failure as not being a failure at all. Maybe it's just an iteration or it's an evolution of a thing. You're doing a series of drawings or paintings in a particular path. Perhaps failure, being the tainted word it is not even accurate in your particular case. Maybe this was one of a dozen attempts at a thing, a piece of a greater whole. Each iteration is not a separate thing, not capable of being a failure because the goal was to nail down a single thumbnail that functioned for your painting. Goal achieved. You don't really need to think about the other 49 thumbnails as failures. They were each iterative, little evolutions toward the solution you were seeking. And sometimes this is how it goes. When I was in college, we had to do so many thumbnails for every graphic design piece. I really do think it was 50. Though there's a possibility that after 15 years, my brain is twisting that a little bit. But I'm almost positive we had to do 50 thumbnails for any project that we did. And what this meant was about half of those were terrible because you got through your first 10 ideas, which were probably solid. And then you just started coming up with things that might work or riffing on other things. And inevitably, a lot of those are really bad. If I were to look at those 50 and find the 35 in there that were really terrible and focus on those, then I did terribly that day. I failed. But if I was to choose to look at the 5 ideas out of 50, 10% of it that were good, then I could walk away from that situation feeling like I had succeeded. And that's so much of this entire concept of failure, is choosing how we frame it, choosing how we think of it. So if you have a whole bunch of pieces and you look at the fact that not all of them are successes and so they're failures, or you're a failure, that's just not productive. It's also not realistic, but it's not productive. If you can look at a series of things that are either iterative or it's an evolution, you're trying to work out an idea, the goal is to just get there by the end of the last piece, the last sketch, the last thumbnail. And if you can do that, then you haven't failed. You've succeeded because you redefined what failure was for this particular situation. Now, here's another angle that you can come at it from, and this is a harder one for me, but I think that it's really beneficial if you can manage to do it. Think of failure as resilience building. Now, I struggle to think about failure this way, but some strong people are able to do so. If you can look at a tough situation and find solace in the fact that it makes you a better person, that your strength developed from the pain makes you better, kudos to you. I have people in my life that are like this, and I marvel at them. I'm not really envious of them, but I have just such a level of admiration for the ability to look at the situation and go, you are in the midst of something terrible, and you are able to just let it slide off your back and think about the fact that this is making you a better artist or a better person, depending on what the situation is. I've known people like this, and it's just such a crazy thing to me. The people that walk away from a failure and say, I'm glad I failed. I'm getting stronger. I'm improving. I'm moving forward. If you are capable of such a thing, hone in on that. What a wonderful perspective it is. And though it's not how most of us function, you might end up being a beacon to lots of other artists who, like myself, struggle in those situations. You can be the person who is encouraging to the struggling artists around you. And so if this is you, thank you so much for being you. We need more of them, and we don't have a ton. On that same train of thought, you can look at failure as developing your patience. If you can find a way to do this, you can reduce your burden as you progress and as you move forward, and you'll benefit dramatically from it. This is in that same idea field as what I mentioned earlier. It's hard. It's a unique quality as a human being that allows you to do this. Patience seems to largely be developed by having to deal with unpleasurable things, things that push you into needing patience. And the reality is, the more patience you have, likely the less disappointed you will be and the more satisfied with life you will be. So if you can choose to see your failures as mere fertilizer for your patience, man, here I would be a little bit envious. This is difficult. I am notoriously impatient, and I feel like so much of art is just learning how to be patient with the fact that it takes a long time to learn anatomy, learning to be patient with the fact that it's going to take you a long time to finish that whole sketchbook. Art is so much about just tolerating the fact that it takes a long time to do anything. And that's also, I think, what lends to the beauty of it, because most people don't stick it out. And so those that do end up cracking into this beautiful thing, and that just makes it more valuable. Failure can also be seen as an indicator of growth. You will not encounter the pain of failure if you are not working on things that are a little bit more difficult than you can achieve now. If you stick to always doing the exact same thing, you will likely not fail, often if ever. And so there's a weird thing that happens here, a duality. If you are challenging yourself reasonably, you are going to fail. If you are trying to run a race faster than you've ever run a race before, you probably can't do that. You're going to fail. You might even puke as you get halfway through the race, but it's an indicator of your forward momentum. It's an indicator of your growth. If we stuck to drawing stick figures like we did when we were 4, failure might not be in our artistic vocabulary. It is the striving to be better, the attempting of new things that results in failures artistically. So take pride in the fact that you are moving, you are growing. Your failure will not even come into focus if you're not trying to do things that you can't already do. This is one that I can actually formulate in my brain. I can actually look at my pieces sometimes, and sometimes I'll look back and see old pieces and go, well, they're improving. Over time, my pieces are improving. But if I'm challenging myself, I'm going to hit roadblocks. I'm going to run into things that are difficult or that I can't do. And so are you. You're going to run into these things that you can't do in that moment. And if you can find a way to reframe it, to think about it as, well, this just means that I'm on the right path, that I'm on the right track, then you're golden. That's a fantastic thing. The only caveat I want to throw in here before moving on to the next one is, if you take on things that are far, far too hard, way beyond where your skill is at this point, you'll just fail time and time and time and time and time again. So if that's the case for you, you're failing, like, not that you feel like you're failing, but you're actually failing on what you're attempting to do time and time again, step it back a little bit. Find a simpler ground, a simpler plateau that you can work on. And then once you've started to succeed maybe on 50% of your pieces, start adding in some other things that are a little bit more challenging. Try redefining success, and then with it, failure. Failure might be defined as a lack of success, as not achieving your goal. In so many ways, we fail because we did not have a great understanding of our goal in any given particular situation. If you redefine the goal, you innately redefine failure and the threshold where it shifts from success to failure. If you can purposefully and specifically redefine success, you can curve many potential failures into something more productive, into stepping stones, into momentum, or even into successes depending on the nature of the goal. And I talked about this a little bit earlier, where we set ourselves up for failure, quite literally here, if we don't understand what we were trying to achieve in a particular situation. Art is so complicated. It's like a giant swamp that we're all trying desperately to swim in, and some of us are in 6 feet of muck, and some of us are on the shore, and some of us are dangling from trees trying not to get eaten by gharials and crocodiles. It's complicated, and it's so overwhelmingly distinct from person to person. So, you need to look at what your particular situation is. Are you hanging from the tree? Are you on the shore? Are you in a boat? And from that, evaluate what your artistic desires and goals are. If you understand those, you can start to define what success and failure look like rationally. And when you redefine success, what your goal is, what you're trying to achieve, you naturally tailor failure to something that is more specific to you. Now, this won't mean that all of your so-called failures are no longer messing with you. They're not causing emotion and emotional distress, but it will at least make sure that your failures are actually failures for what you're trying to achieve. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into this. When you sit down to work on a specific thing, take a moment at the beginning of that session and define mentally. You don't even have to write it down, but I like writing things down. Define mentally what success is, what the success conditions are for this. Because there's a lot of different things going on with that individual piece, and really probably only one component that you're really honing in on and working on right then. So think about it and figure out how you can redefine success to therefore redefine failure. Sometimes it's not a failure at all. It's just experimentation. For some of us, everything is about labeling. And if you can label this project, this sketchbook, this period of time as experimenting, where the express purpose is just to try new things, then failure only exists if you don't touch stylus to surface. This is a really simple and lighthearted one, but for some of us, this will work fantastically. Sometimes you need to set aside an ugly sketchbook, and everything in that is just allowed to be ugly. And therefore, what does failure even look like in that scenario? So if you can reframe how you're thinking about the particular time that you're putting into it, like, this is just an experiment, I'm just trying something new. Like, the failure condition for that is bizarre and might not even come into effect for what you're doing. So sometimes just label things differently in your head. Label this as experimentation and move forward. This is going to be the last one of these that I'm going to hit on today. And obviously, this list is not exhaustive. A lot of the things that we've been talking about lately in the podcast have been very complicated, very emotional issues, things that are very much just a part of being a creative individual, someone who has that pressure to produce things, to bring new things into the universe. But this is perhaps a really productive one, and one that I've honed in on recently. You can choose to look at failure as fuel for the future. I have a sketchbook session on this channel where I went back to a failed sketchbook page. In that video, I went back to a page that frustrated me terribly. I quit that page halfway through. I walked away and I didn't open up the sketchbook for weeks. Upon returning, my emotions had cooled. I was no longer charged by that particular page or set of pages. I decided to reclaim it. In the hour or two that followed, I crafted some interesting things. I had fun and was able to discuss with others the process of taking back something from the realm of failure. I was able to re-engage with a failed piece, really truly a failed piece. I stopped drawing that evening because I was so frustrated with it. I was able to go back to that piece and do something productive with it. I was able to do something productive mentally. I was able to think about why it felt like a failure, maybe the headspace that I was in. Had I had a really tough day? But practically, I was also able to just turn those drawings into something far more interesting. And I was able to walk away smiling. And for me, a lot of times I just need to leave the art session before I get frustrated or start making stupid mistakes. Art's hard to get into. I don't always want to draw or paint. And so if I can walk away from that session not terribly frustrated, then I'm going to be in a better position later. Your failures, your broken, terrible pieces can be fuel for later. They can spark ideas. They can be built upon. They can be deconstructed and reassembled into new things. They are pieces of you. Don't hate on them. Figure out where they fit into your journey and what use they can have in the future. Very seldom is a piece totally useless. Each has a role to play, it seems, even if it is just to be the springboard for something more productive later. And again, this might be optimistic, and this is the weird place where my optimism kind of meets my pessimism, where I can look at something and go, that was terrible, that sucked, I hated doing it. But now I'm going to come back to it later, and I'm going to try to reclaim it. I'm going to try to take it out of that negative thought memory place in my brain. And I'm going to forcibly shove it into a waffle iron and make something delicious and beautiful out of it. I know that didn't make any sense, but waffles are fantastic, and I love them, and I think that they are a wonderful excuse. And I have no idea how I got to this phrase, but we're just going to keep moving. So anytime that you can reclaim something that had a negative label on it and put it into a positive place, you are going to benefit from it tremendously. So this has just been a quick list. I know it's not super quick because we're like 26 minutes in, but this has been a quick list of things that we can as artists look at when it comes to reframing failure, to reprocessing failure. It's an integral part of our growth. And if you are one of those blessed individuals who just is unbothered by failure, thank you for being you, and please leave something in the comments cluing all of us normal people in on like how we can avoid that or become more like you, because that would be fantastic, and I would much appreciate it, and I know a lot of the others would as well. So, as always, thank you for listening. I hope that some of these sparked something in you as you were listening to them. I hope that there's some encouragement here somewhere, if for no other reason than the fact that there are many other people like you out there who also struggle with over-contextualizing their artwork as failures. We can all help each other by moving forward, by being encouraging to one another as a community and pushing forward and understanding that failure by its nature is just a part of the art making process. It doesn't make your piece a failure. It doesn't make you a failure as an artist, and it certainly does not make you a failure as a human being. So thank you again. I really appreciate all of you. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.